Dawn spread across the Nebraska plains, the morning mist clinging to every blade of dry grass, the light shimmering like forgotten specks of gold, scattered across the vast land. Inside a weathered wooden farmhouse at the edge of Mallister town, Elizabeth sat by the window, her thin hands clutching a faded blue shawl her mother had left behind. That shawl was the only relic of gentler days, before her father's death, before the family sank into endless debt. Her sister, Margaret, was the one chosen to become a mail-order bride, bound for a marriage arranged with a stranger in the far west. Margaret was beautiful, radiant, graceful, the family's single hope for survival. But at the last moment, Margaret broke down in tears, trembling, as she confessed her heart belonged to another man, a poor but earnest young lawyer. Their mother, desperate to stave off ruin, turned her gaze toward Elizabeth. "You'll go in her place," their mother said, her voice hoarse, her eyes shimmering with fear and pleading. Elizabeth froze, wanting to refuse, but her mother's trembling grip held her fast. And so it was that Elizabeth, the plain sister, the one no one ever praised for beauty, the one who carried only bright eyes and quiet resilience, nodded her consent. The rattling train carried her across endless fields, majestic mountains, and rust-colored rivers. In her chest lived both dread and a flicker of defiance. Tucked inside her bodice, pressed against her heart, was the handwritten proposal of a stranger, Thomas Callahan, a widowed rancher surviving in the harsh land of Wyoming. That letter felt less like a promise, more like a sentence. When the train ground to a halt, Elizabeth stepped down, her pale blue dress sweeping up dust as her eyes caught the figure waiting at the platform. A tall man stood there, shoulders broad under a coarse brown shirt, his gray-blue eyes cold as a stormy sky. This was Thomas Callahan. But instead of the disappointment Elizabeth feared, his gaze lingered on her, longer than expected, as though he had seen something surprising, something that held him still. Elizabeth swallowed hard, her heart pounding like a runaway horse. Would the truth about Margaret be revealed now? Or was this the moment fate bent its course in ways neither of them could foresee? At the far end of the platform, a sudden gust of wind tore the shawl from Elizabeth's shoulders, carrying it straight toward Thomas. He caught it in one swift motion, then looked at her again, and in his eyes something softened, as if a decision had just been carved deep inside him. Elizabeth didn't know it yet, but that fleeting instant sealed an unexpected choice. Thomas Callahan, instead of turning away, had silently chosen the girl before him, forever. But would Margaret's secret soon surface? And if it did, what would become of this fragile, newborn love? The dusty main street of the small Wyoming town stretched out before Elizabeth, like the backdrop of a dream she wasn't sure she wanted to step into. Her shoes crunched against the gravel as Thomas walked beside her, his long stride steady, purposeful. He carried her trunk as though it weighed nothing, though Elizabeth could feel the pull of its burden in her own chest. Every step felt heavier than the last. No words had been exchanged since the shawl incident at the station. Elizabeth stole glances at the man's stern profile, the square jaw shadowed with stubble, the way the sunlight caught in his hair, bronzed from hours under the unforgiving western sky. He didn't look like a man searching for beauty or softness. He looked like survival carved into human form. They reached his wagon, an old but well-kept vehicle hitched to two chestnut horses. With practiced ease, he lifted her trunk into the back and offered his hand. Elizabeth hesitated, her heart stumbling. Taking that hand meant stepping fully into the lie. Still, she placed her gloved palm into his, feeling the warmth of his skin, the calluses that told a story of hard work and long days. "Elizabeth, is it?" His voice was low, measured. Her breath hitched. The letter had been addressed to Margaret. Her name wasn't supposed to be known. But then she realized, of course, Margaret must have signed in her stead. The rancher had no reason to doubt. "Yes," she whispered, steadying her voice. "Elizabeth." He gave a short nod, helping her into the wagon. The horses snorted, and with a flick of the reins, they were moving, leaving the town behind. The land unfolded in endless waves, golden grasses, jagged hills, the occasional hawk cutting across the horizon. Elizabeth felt both swallowed and freed by the expanse. Here, no one knew her. Here, she could become someone else entirely, or lose herself altogether. "You've come far," Thomas said after a long silence, his eyes fixed ahead. "Yes." She clasped her hands in her lap, trying to will her nerves still. "It was a long journey. You'll find Wyoming unforgiving." His words were plain, but not cruel. "Weather turns fast. Land doesn't give easy. People have to earn their place." Elizabeth found herself answering before she thought. "I've never expected life to give easy." For the first time, his gaze flicked toward her, appraising. Not unkind, not cold, just measuring. The wagon rattled on for hours. The sun climbed, then dipped, painting the sky in copper hues. Elizabeth grew weary, but when she saw the ranch in the distance, her breath caught. A vast stretch of fenced land, dotted with cattle. A low, sprawling house built of timber, its roof weathered by storms. A barn, a windmill, the skeleton of a corral. It wasn't grand, but it was alive, functional, enduring. "This is Callahan Ranch," Thomas said simply. Elizabeth pressed her lips together. This would be her new world. A figure came rushing from the barn, a boy no more than 12, his hair the same sun-streaked brown as Thomas's, his face lit with curiosity. "Pa!" he shouted, before stopping short to stare at Elizabeth. "This is Samuel," Thomas introduced. "My son." The boy's wide eyes narrowed, as if measuring her worth in a single look. Elizabeth's chest tightened. She had not prepared for this, for a child who might resent her intrusion. "Ma?" Samuel's voice cracked. Elizabeth's heart twisted. She shook her head gently. "No, Samuel. I'm Elizabeth." Thomas's jaw tightened. He gave his son a look that silenced further questions. But Elizabeth had seen the truth in Samuel's eyes. The wound of a boy who had lost his mother. The confusion of seeing a stranger step into a space that could never be filled. That night, Elizabeth stood in the small bedroom Thomas had prepared for her. The window opened to the prairie, where the wind carried the scent of sage and earth. She held the blue shawl to her chest, her secret pressing harder against her ribs. Margaret's name was written in the contract. Margaret's promise was in Thomas's hands. And yet, here she was, wearing another woman's fate like a borrowed dress. She heard footsteps outside her door, heavy, deliberate. Her breath stilled, then a pause, the faint creak of wood, as if he lingered there, undecided. But no knock came. The footsteps receded. Elizabeth sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the dark window pane until her reflection blurred into shadow. Tomorrow she would begin her life as Thomas Callahan's bride. But for how long could she carry the lie before the prairie winds themselves tore it from her lips? And what would Thomas do if he learned that the woman he had chosen wasn't the one promised to him at all? The first morning on the Callahan Ranch came with a chill that cut through the wooden walls, the kind that reminded Elizabeth how far she was from everything familiar. The rooster crowed, and the smell of dust and hay drifted in through the cracks. She rose before dawn, hands trembling as she tied back her hair, and stepped out into a world painted silver by the early light. Thomas was already outside, tending to the horses. His movements were economical, precise, as though each task was part of a rhythm he had long since mastered. The air smelled of leather, sweat, and earth. Elizabeth stood a moment, watching. She had never seen anyone so firmly rooted in their world. "You're up early," he said, without looking at her. "I wanted to help," she answered, her voice soft but steady. His eyes flicked to her, then down to her shoes. Too fine for mud, too thin for frost. He handed her a bucket. "Then fetch water." "The well's over there." The handle bit into her palm as she walked toward the well, her skirts dragging through the dirt. Each step was heavier than she expected, the bucket filling with the weight of what this new life demanded. When she returned, arms aching, Thomas gave no praise, only took the bucket with a nod. And yet, something in the silence felt like acceptance. By breakfast, Samuel was at the table, arms crossed, his young face etched with suspicion. He poked at his food, eyes darting at Elizabeth as though she were a stranger trespassing in his home. She tried a smile. "I thought maybe I could make pie tonight. My mother taught me." "We don't need pie," the boy muttered. Thomas gave him a sharp look, but Elizabeth raised a hand gently. "It's all right," she said. She knew trust wasn't something she could demand. It would have to be earned, spoonful by spoonful, day by day. After the meal, Thomas left to mend fences along the northern pasture. Elizabeth followed, though he hadn't asked her to. The prairie stretched endlessly, sky pressing down in a wide dome, the grass whispering in the wind. She carried a basket with tools, struggling to keep up with his long strides. "You don't have to," he said finally, glancing at her. "I know," she replied, "but I want to." For a moment, something unreadable passed across his face, then vanished. They worked in silence, the only sounds the groan of wood and the cry of distant crows. Elizabeth's hands blistered, but she kept going, unwilling to show weakness. When at last they paused, Thomas pulled a flask of water from his coat and held it out. Their fingers brushed as she took it, and for a second the world seemed to still. The wind quieted, the sky darkened slightly as clouds gathered. Elizabeth sipped, then handed it back, heart racing with the realization that the lie she carried was not the only thing binding her to him now. By late afternoon, a storm rolled over the hills. The wind howled, rattling the fence posts they had worked so hard to secure. Thomas barked orders, Samuel rushing to bring the horses into the barn. Elizabeth held the shawl tight around her shoulders, rain lashing against her face as she stumbled to help. "Inside!" Thomas shouted, his voice lost in the roar. But Elizabeth refused, running toward a calf tangled near the edge of the corral. Her skirts caught on barbed wire, ripping as she freed the animal. She shoved it forward just as Thomas reached her, his hand gripping her arm. "Are you out of your mind?" he growled, dragging her back through the storm. Her breath came in gasps, her hair plastered to her cheeks, but her eyes met his. "I couldn't leave it." For the first time, his expression cracked. He looked at her, not with anger, but with something else. A recognition, perhaps. A respect. When the storm finally passed, leaving the ranch soaked and battered, Thomas stood by the barn, staring at Elizabeth as she soothed the frightened calf. His jaw clenched, his chest rising and falling with something unspoken. She felt his gaze, the weight of it, and something within her stirred. something dangerous, something she couldn't allow to grow too strong. Because if he ever learned she wasn't the woman he thought he had chosen, that fragile thread between them would snap. That night, Elizabeth lay awake, listening to the creak of the house in the wind. The storm outside had passed, but inside her, another storm was only beginning to form, and she couldn't know that Samuel, lying awake in the next room, had overheard enough to suspect that Elizabeth wasn't who she claimed to be. The morning after the storm dawned eerily still. The prairie smelled of wet earth and broken grass, and the barn roof dripped with steady rhythm. Elizabeth rose early, hoping the silence in the house meant peace, but she sensed the tension before she even stepped into the kitchen. Samuel sat at the table, his small frame rigid, his eyes sharper than any boy's should be. "You're not her," he blurted, breaking the hush. Elizabeth froze, her hand hovering over the kettle. "What do you mean?" He narrowed his gaze. "You're not the woman Pa was writing to. You said your name was Elizabeth, but the letters, Pa read them to me. They were from a Margaret." His tone wasn't accusing so much as wounded, like a child who'd just caught an adult in a cruel trick. Her chest constricted, the truth clawing at her throat. She opened her mouth, but footsteps thundered down the stairs. Thomas appeared, his presence filling the room, his eyes flicking between his son and Elizabeth. "What's this?" he asked. "Nothing," Elizabeth said quickly, her voice tighter than she intended. She busied herself with the kettle, pouring water into mugs, as though the motion could erase Samuel's words, but Thomas didn't look convinced. Later that day, Elizabeth tried to lose herself in chores. She scrubbed the wooden floors until her knees ached, baked bread until her hands smelled of flour, anything to quiet the restless guilt gnawing inside her. But everywhere she turned, Samuel's eyes followed, accusing and curious all at once. By afternoon, Thomas saddled a horse. "Fence along the ridge came down in the storm," he said. "I'll need you." His words were aimed at Samuel, but then his gaze shifted to Elizabeth. "You should come too." Her breath caught. It was both invitation and test. The three of them rode out, the prairie still damp, the sky a wide expanse of pale blue. Elizabeth's horse jolted beneath her, unsteady, but she clung to the reins with determination. Thomas rode ahead, strong and sure, Samuel close behind. At the ridge, they worked together, resetting posts, pulling wire. Elizabeth's palms blistered anew, but she didn't complain. Every hammer strike was her answer to Samuel's suspicion, her way of proving she belonged here, even if by deception. At one point, she stumbled, nearly driving a nail into her own hand. Thomas caught her wrist, steadying her. For a moment, their eyes met, hers wide with apology, his searching, unreadable. Then he let go, his jaw tight, as though the contact had said more than he intended. By the time the sun dipped low, painting the hills in amber light, the fence stood solid again. Samuel leaned on his hammer, sweat streaking his young face. "She worked hard, Pa," he said reluctantly, almost grudgingly. Thomas glanced at Elizabeth, a flicker of something softer passing through his eyes. "Yes," he said simply. On the ride home, silence stretched between them, but it was a different kind of silence, heavier, charged. Elizabeth kept her gaze forward, though she felt Thomas's presence beside her like a weight she couldn't shake. That evening, as she tucked the shawl around her shoulders, Samuel lingered in the doorway. "If you're lying," he said quietly, "he deserves to know." Her breath faltered. She wanted to tell him the whole truth, that she hadn't come to trick anyone, that she had stepped into her sister's place to save her family. But the words stuck. "Sometimes," she whispered, Life gives us choices we never wanted to make. And sometimes we just keep going. Samuel's brow furrowed, but he didn't argue. He left her with her thoughts, the creak of the old house echoing around her. That night, Elizabeth sat by the window, watching the prairie stars ignite the sky. Each one felt like a secret, distant and burning. She touched the blue shawl, pressing it to her chest, and wondered how long she could live in the shadow of another woman's name. In the silence, she heard the front door close. Thomas's boots thudded against the porch. She leaned forward, peering through the glass, and saw him standing in the dark yard, staring out across the endless land. His shoulders were heavy with burdens she couldn't name. Elizabeth's heart ached. She didn't know whether it was from the lie that bound them, or from the truth rising between them like a fire she could not put out. And in the distance, beneath the cover of night, a lone rider approached the ranch, carrying news that would unravel everything. The crunch of hooves on hard earth broke the stillness of the prairie night. Elizabeth leaned forward at the window, her fingers tightening around the frame. In the dim glow of starlight, she could make out the lone rider cresting the ridge, his silhouette sharp against the horizon. He rode with urgency, dust rising behind him, and something in the deliberate pace of his horse sent a shiver through her chest. Down below, Thomas straightened from the porch railing. His hand hovered instinctively near the revolver holstered at his side, the gesture more habit than threat. "Stay inside," he muttered without looking up, though Elizabeth doubted he knew she was watching. The rider pulled his horse to a halt at the edge of the yard. For a moment neither man spoke, the night stretching taut as a drawn bowstring. Then Thomas stepped forward, boots crunching on gravel. "Evening," the rancher said, his tone flat, unreadable. The stranger pushed back his hat, revealing a weathered face, lined by sun and wind. "Thomas Callahan?" he asked. His voice carried the low rasp of a man who'd seen more miles than comfort. "That's right. I come from Mallister." The man's gaze flicked toward the house, where Elizabeth stood frozen behind the glass. "Got a message." Her blood iced. Mallister. Home. Thomas didn't move, but his silence demanded explanation. The rider reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope sealed with wax. From the Mallister family. Marked urgent. Couldn't wait. Elizabeth's breath caught. Her knees weakened, and she pressed her hand to the window pane. She knew what it was before Thomas even took it. He slit the seal with the edge of his knife, the paper tearing louder than the wind itself. His eyes moved across the page, line by line. His jaw tightened, his lips thinned. Then slowly, he folded the letter and looked up, his gaze cutting toward the window where Elizabeth stood. Her heart crashed against her ribs. Thomas turned back to the rider. "You'll be needin' a meal before you ride again," he said curtly. "Barn's open for your horse." The man tipped his hat in thanks and led his mount away. Elizabeth stumbled back from the window, her breath ragged. She clutched the shawl to her chest, as if it could shield her from the storm she knew was about to break. Moments later the door swung open. Thomas stepped inside, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He didn't call her name, but she felt the weight of his presence before she saw him. His figure filled the doorway to the kitchen, the letter gripped tight in his hand. "Elizabeth." His voice was calm, but too calm, the kind that comes before thunder. "You got something to tell me?" Her lips parted, but no sound came. The truth clawed at her throat, desperate to spill. Yet fear held her still. the fear of losing everything she had barely begun to grasp. Samuel appeared at the stairs, his small face pale, eyes wide. He looked between his father and Elizabeth, the tension in the air thick enough to choke. "What does it say?" the boy asked. Thomas didn't answer. His gaze never left Elizabeth, steady as a rifle sight. She swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "It was Margaret. She was meant to come. But she couldn't. And I—" Her voice broke. "I came in her place." Silence fell like a hammer. Thomas's hand curled tighter around the letter. "You lied," he said, not loud, but each word struck like iron. Elizabeth flinched. "I had no choice. My family, they—" "No choice?" His tone cut sharp. "You had a choice. You made it." Tears burned her eyes. "Would you rather I'd left you standing alone at that station?" His jaw clenched. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then he turned away, pacing the length of the room, the floorboards groaning under his weight. Samuel's voice broke the silence, small and trembling. "Pa." But Thomas raised a hand, silencing his son. He faced Elizabeth again, his eyes storm-dark. "I don't take kindly to deceit. Out here, lies can kill a man faster than bullets. You should remember that." Her chest heaved, the words like blows. She wanted to explain, to beg for understanding, but she saw in his face that the wound was too fresh, the trust too newly cracked. Thomas crumpled the letter in his fist. "You'll stay, for now," he said at last, his voice low, controlled. "Samuel needs food on the table. Cattle need tending. But don't mistake this house for forgiveness." With that, he strode out, the door slamming behind him. Elizabeth sank into a chair, her body shaking. Samuel lingered in the shadows, watching her with eyes that held both pity and blame. She pressed her face into her hands, the shawl slipping to the floor. The secret was no longer hers to bear. It was out in the open, raw, and dangerous. And as the wind howled outside the cabin walls, Elizabeth knew the hardest battle wasn't the storm she had survived, but the man whose trust she had shattered. What she couldn't know was that far beyond the ranch, another shadow was stirring. Someone who would use her lie as a weapon, threatening not just her heart, but everything the Callahans held dear. The prairie lay under a thin veil of mist the next morning, the earth damp from the storm, the grass bending beneath the weight of dew. Elizabeth stood at the porch rail, her shawl clutched tight around her shoulders, staring out at the horizon where dawn burned faintly. Sleep had eluded her. Thomas's words still echoed inside her chest like hammer blows. "Don't mistake this house for forgiveness." Behind her, the cabin creaked awake. Samuel thudded down the stairs, his steps hesitant. He paused in the doorway, studying her with those sharp, restless eyes. Elizabeth tried a smile, though it trembled. "Good morning." He didn't return it. "Pa's at the south field," he said, as though the words were an accusation. Then he added, quieter, "He's still mad." Elizabeth nodded, unable to defend herself. "I know." Samuel shifted on his feet. For all his suspicion, the boy looked torn, caught between loyalty to his father and a reluctant sympathy for the woman who had worked beside them in storm and sweat. But before either could say more, the distant sound of hooves shattered the fragile silence. Elizabeth's head snapped up. Another rider. This one came fast, reckless, dirt flying behind his horse's pounding hooves. As he drew closer, she saw the glint of a rifle slung across his back, the hard tilt of his hat shadowing his face. Instinct prickled along her skin. This was no messenger. Thomas appeared moments later, striding from the field with his revolver already in hand. His voice carried sharp and commanding. "Inside, both of you." Samuel obeyed at once, But Elizabeth lingered, frozen by the raw intensity in Thomas's stance. He didn't glance her way. His focus was locked on the stranger pulling up hard at the yard, dust billowing around him. The rider swung down, boots striking earth. His eyes, cold and narrow, scanned the ranch before settling on Thomas. "Callahan," he drawled, his tone edged with disdain. "Word travels fast. Seems you got yourself a bride who ain't who she claims." Elizabeth's blood iced. Thomas's jaw tightened. "You've no business here." The man smirked, spitting into the dirt. "Oh, I reckon I do. You remember Jonas Pike? Man you beat to that patch of land near Sweetwater. He remembers you. Says you took what wasn't yours. He figures this bride of yours is a fine leverage to settle the score." Elizabeth's stomach twisted. She felt every muscle in Thomas's body coil, a predator ready to strike. "You'll tell Pike he's wasting his time," Thomas said, voice low, deadly calm. The rider's smirk widened. "Oh, I'll tell him. But I'll also tell him she's here. Soft little thing, wrapped up in lies. Folks don't take kindly to deceivers out here. Be a shame if that truth spread faster than she could run." Elizabeth's breath caught. The man's words weren't just a threat to her reputation. They were a noose, tightening around the fragile trust Thomas still clung to. Thomas took a single step forward, revolver glinting in the morning light. "You bring trouble to my land again. You won't ride away. You understand me?" The rider's eyes narrowed, but he gave a mocking tip of his hat. "We'll see, Callahan. We'll see." With that, he swung onto his horse and thundered back into the horizon, leaving dust and unease in his wake. The yard fell silent again, save for the pounding of Elizabeth's heart. She turned to Thomas, desperate to speak, to explain, to beg him not to let her deception become ammunition for men like Pike. But his expression was carved from stone. "You see now?" His words were cold, measured. "Out here, lies don't stay buried. They draw wolves." She flinched, tears burning her eyes. "I never meant—" He cut her off, voice rising like distant thunder. "Meaning don't matter, Elizabeth. Only truth does, and truth's what keeps a ranch alive when men like Pike come sniffing." She swallowed hard, the weight of his disappointment heavier than any storm. That night the ranch felt different. The walls seemed thinner, the shadows darker. Elizabeth lay awake, listening to Samuel's breathing in the next room, the creak of the windmill outside, and Thomas's footsteps pacing the porch like a sentinel. She pressed the shawl against her chest, its fabric worn and fraying, as though it could keep her tethered to something solid. Yet the truth gnawed at her. Her presence here had already made them a target. And as sleep finally claimed her in fitful snatches, she dreamed of fire on the horizon, of riders thundering through the night, and of Thomas standing between her and the storm, with eyes that no longer knew whether to shield her or cast her out. Far off, beyond the Callahan land, Jonas Pike himself was gathering men, their rifles gleaming under the moon, ready to test how strong or fragile the Callahans truly were. The days that followed carried a stillness that wasn't peace but pressure, like the prairie itself was holding its breath. Elizabeth moved through the ranch like a shadow, working harder than ever, mending clothes, hauling water, even tending to cattle when Thomas was out on the far fields. Yet no matter how many tasks she threw herself into, she couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching from the ridges. Samuel noticed it too. The boy lingered near the house, restless, glancing at the horizon as though he expected riders to appear at any moment. His mistrust of Elizabeth softened, not out of forgiveness, but because both of them shared the same fear. Jonas Pike was coming. One evening, as the sun bled red across the sky, Elizabeth found Thomas repairing the barn door. His shirt was streaked with dust and sweat, his arms corded with the day's work. She hesitated before stepping closer, the air between them thick with unspoken words. "You should have told me sooner," he said without looking up, his hammer striking wood in sharp rhythm. "I was afraid," she whispered. His gaze finally met hers, grey-blue and stormy. "Fear's a luxury you can't afford out here. Lies even less." Her throat tightened. "I know, and if I could take it back." "You can't." He drove the nail home with a final blow, the wood shuddering under it. "What you can do is decide whether you'll stand when trouble comes, or run like the sister you took the place of." The words cut deep, but beneath the steel she heard something else. A challenge, not a dismissal. That night, Samuel crept into Elizabeth's room, his small face pale in the moonlight. "I heard them," he whispered. "Riders, out by the creek. I think Pike's men are scouting." Elizabeth's pulse quickened. "Did your pa see them?" "Not yet." Samuel bit his lip. "You think they'll come here?" She brushed his hair back gently, her hand trembling. "They might, but we'll be ready." The next morning, Thomas saddled the horses early. "I'm riding into town," he said, voice clipped. "Need to speak with the sheriff. Pike won't wait long." Elizabeth felt the words burn in her chest before she spoke them. "Let me come." His eyes narrowed. "Town's no place for you. Neither is here if men like Pike are watching the ranch. If this fight's because of me, then I won't hide." For a long moment, he studied her, his jaw tight. Then, with a reluctant nod, he handed her the smaller of the horses. The ride into town was silent but heavy with meaning. Elizabeth's hands blistered on the reins, her body sore from the saddle, yet she sat straight, unwilling to show weakness. She felt Thomas's presence beside her like a shield, though whether he guarded her out of duty or something deeper, she dared not hope. Mallister streets were dusty and tense when they arrived. Men lingered outside the saloon, eyes tracking them as they passed. Elizabeth felt their stares, some curious, some cruel, and she pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders. Inside the sheriff's office, Thomas laid the crumpled letter on the desk. The sheriff, a stout man with tired eyes, read it, then leaned back with a sigh. "Pike's been trouble since the war. Lost his land. Blames half the county. If he's set his sights on you, Callahan, it won't end with talk." "I don't need talk," Thomas said. "I need to know where he's gathering his men." The sheriff hesitated. "Word is, he's got near a dozen, well armed. If he comes, you'll be outnumbered." Thomas's jaw set like stone. "Let him come." Elizabeth's breath caught. A dozen men, guns, blood. The thought of Thomas facing that storm made her stomach twist. She stepped forward, her voice low but firm. "Then we'll fight with more than guns. We'll fight with truth." Both men looked at her, startled. She lifted her chin. "Pike's power is fear and rumor. If people believe his lies about me, then he wins before he fires a shot. But if they know the truth, if they see me standing here, not running, not hiding, then maybe Pike won't have the same hold." The sheriff frowned. "Truth don't always carry weight in this town, miss. But courage does." Thomas's eyes lingered on her, unreadable, as though weighing not just her words, but her soul. Finally, he turned back to the sheriff. Then we'll need more than courage. We'll need men willing to stand. They rode back under a sky bruised with approaching storm clouds. Elizabeth's hands shook as she clutched the reins, but inside her, something steadier had begun to kindle. She had come here in her sister's place, bound by fear and duty. But now, with danger closing in, she felt a new thread pulling tight around her heart. Not just survival, not just penance, something fiercer. That night, as the wind rose and the prairie whispered of coming violence, Elizabeth sat by the fire. Samuel curled asleep nearby, Thomas sharpening his rifle in silence. She glanced at him, at the lines of strain etched into his face, and a thought struck her with the weight of destiny. When Pike comes, she will not run. She will stand. For Thomas, for Samuel, for herself. And far away, under the black sky, Jonas Pike tightened his saddle straps and told his men to ride at dawn. Dawn broke with a bitter wind. The prairie grass bent low, whispering in the same direction, as if the land itself leaned away from what was coming. Elizabeth stood on the porch, her shawl whipping around her shoulders, and felt the air change. There was no birdsong, no distant lowing of cattle, only silence. It was the kind of silence that arrived before calamity. Inside, Samuel hovered near the table, his small hands tightening and loosening around the handle of a knife he wasn't meant to hold. He looked far too young for battle, yet his eyes had the same restless sharpness Elizabeth had seen in Thomas. Thomas himself was outside by the barn, checking the gate, oiling the rifle that had become an extension of his arm. He moved with a calmness that was almost frightening, as though he had walked this road before, as though facing Pike was inevitable. Elizabeth joined him, the cold biting her cheeks. "They'll come today," she whispered. His eyes flicked toward the horizon, then back to her. "Yes," she swallowed, her throat raw. "And if it goes wrong, it won't." His tone was iron. "But if it does, you take Samuel and you ride. Don't look back." Her chest tightened. She wanted to protest, to swear she would never leave him. But his gaze was so steady, so absolute, that the words died. Instead, she touched the shawl at her shoulders, her mother's relic, and whispered, "Then you fight like hell, Thomas Callahan, because I won't forgive you if you fall." For a fleeting second, something softened in his eyes, something dangerously close to tenderness. Then he turned away, shoulders squaring, as hoofbeats thundered faintly in the distance. They came like a storm. Jonas Pike led them, his black horse lathered in sweat, a dozen riders at his back. Dust billowed in their wake, rifles glinting in the rising sun. Elizabeth's stomach turned to ice. Pike pulled up at the edge of the yard, his mouth curling into a sneer. He was a broad man, scarred across the jaw, his eyes sharp with cruelty. "Callahan," he called, his voice carrying across the distance. "You've got something that don't belong to you. Land. And a liar." Elizabeth flinched. Thomas stepped forward, rifle cradled but ready. His voice was steady, each word clipped. "This land is mine by right, and the woman under my roof is mine by choice. You'll leave now, Pike, or you won't leave at all." Pike barked a laugh. Big words for a man standing alone. He raised his hand, and his men fanned out, forming a half-circle around the ranch. Dust swirled, the sound of leather and steel filling the air. Elizabeth's pulse hammered. She wanted to scream, to beg Thomas to retreat, but she stood rooted, her fingers digging into the porch rail. Pike's gaze slid to her, his sneer widening. That her, the substitute bride, ain't even the one promised. Folks in town been whispering, Callahan, about how you got tricked. You letting a liar sit at your table. The words struck like a whip. Elizabeth's cheeks burned with shame, but she lifted her chin. Her voice rang out before fear could stop it. I may not be the sister you expected, but I've stood through your storms, Pike. I've worked this land, bled for it, and I'll die for it before I let you take it. For a heartbeat, silence stretched. Even Pike's men hesitated, eyes narrowing at the steel in her tone. Thomas's gaze snapped to her, shock flashing across his face, quickly replaced by something fiercer, something that looked almost like pride. Pike spat into the dirt. Then so be it. His rifle jerked up, and the yard exploded with gunfire. The world became chaos. Bullets tore through fence posts, splinters flying. Samuel screamed from inside, ducking behind the table. Thomas dropped to one knee, firing with deadly precision. One of Pike's men toppled from his horse. Elizabeth's body moved before her mind caught up. She grabbed the shotgun propped by the door, her hands shaking, and fired into the air. The blast rang like thunder, scattering birds from the trees. Pike's men faltered, startled by the unexpected defiance. Thomas shouted, "Reload!" tossing her shells without looking, his trust in her absolute in that moment. Her hands fumbled, then steadied, sliding shells into the barrel with surprising speed. Pike cursed, spurring his horse forward, but Thomas's shot rang true, grazing Pike's arm and spinning him back. The outlaw roared in fury, blood dripping down his sleeve. The fight raged across the yard. Horses screamed, men shouted, gunfire cracked against the wide sky. Elizabeth fired again, the recoil jolting her shoulder, but she held firm. Beside her, Thomas moved like a storm given flesh, every shot deliberate, every step shielding the house behind him. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the air shifted. Two of Pike's men lay wounded, another limped away, cursing. The others pulled back, uncertainty breaking their lines. Pike glared, his face twisted with rage, but he saw what his men already knew. The Callahans would not fall easy. He spat again, his voice venomous. "This ain't over, Callahan. You can't hold out forever." With a final glare at Elizabeth, he wheeled his horse and thundered off, his men scattering after him. Silence returned, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the rasp of Thomas's breath. Elizabeth lowered the shotgun, her arms trembling. Thomas turned to her, his eyes blazing, his chest heaving with more than exertion. For a long, charged moment, they simply stared. Two souls who had just walked through fire together. Elizabeth wanted to speak, to explain, to apologize again. But before she could, Thomas stepped closer, his hand brushing her arm, not rough, not cold, but grounding. "You didn't run," he said quietly. Her voice broke. "I couldn't." The faintest ghost of a smile touched his lips, gone as quickly as it came. He glanced toward the horizon, where dust still lingered from Pike's retreat. "He'll be back, stronger." Elizabeth nodded, her grip tightening on the shawl. "Then so will we." What none of them saw was Samuel standing in the doorway, wide-eyed and pale, because he knew Pike's retreat was not surrender, but a promise. And promises in the West were written in blood. The prairie never truly returned to silence after Pike's raid. Every rustle in the grass, every distant crack of a branch felt like an echo of gunfire waiting to happen. Elizabeth woke each morning with her heart already pounding, the memory of rifles and dust sharp in her mind. Thomas threw himself into fortifying the ranch. Fences were reinforced, the barn doors braced, ammunition checked and rechecked. His movements were relentless, precise, as though if he worked hard enough, he could will Pike's threat away. Elizabeth watched him from the porch, sweat glistening on his brow, his shirt clinging to his back. He moved like a man haunted by more than just Pike, haunted by the weight of protecting everything he loved. Samuel followed his father everywhere now, no longer the restless boy, but a shadow in training. He learned how to clean a rifle, how to set traps, how to listen to the wind. Elizabeth's heart clenched each time she saw his small hands fumble with tasks far too heavy for his age. Childhood had been ripped from him by the same storm that had swept her into their lives. One evening, as the sky burned gold, Elizabeth carried a basin of water to Thomas. He wiped his hands, nodding in thanks, but his eyes never left the horizon. "You're waiting," she said softly. "For Pike." Her voice trembled. "And if he doesn't come?" Thomas finally looked at her, his eyes weary but unyielding. "He'll come. Men like him don't stop until they've taken something or been put in the ground." Elizabeth's breath hitched. "Then we'll put him there." A flicker of surprise crossed his face, quickly hidden beneath his usual steel. But she saw it, the faint crack in his armor, the recognition that she wasn't just a burden to protect. She was standing with him. That night, thunder rolled low across the plains. Elizabeth sat awake by the window, shawl around her shoulders, when Samuel crept in. His eyes were wide, his voice barely a whisper. "There's smoke. Out by the east pasture." Her blood froze. She woke Thomas at once. Within minutes, he was in the saddle, rifle slung, Samuel clutching the reins of a second horse. Elizabeth ran after them, her skirts tangling in the grass. "No," Thomas barked. "Stay here." But she shook her head fiercely. "Not again. Not while it's my fault he's here at all." He stared at her, jaw tight, then gave a sharp nod. Together, they rode into the night. The smell hit first, acrid, bitter, the stench of burning grass. Then the glow rose over the ridge, fire devouring the dry land, sparks flying like wild stars. Pike's revenge had begun. Thomas dismounted at the edge of the flames, barking orders. "Samuel, fetch water from the creek. Elizabeth, help me cut a break." Elizabeth grabbed a shovel, her hands blistering as she tore at the earth, beating back flames with raw desperation. Sparks singed her skirts, smoke choked her lungs, but she didn't falter. Beside her, Thomas swung an axe, felling brush to starve the fire's path. Samuel stumbled under the weight of a bucket, his face streaked with soot. Elizabeth ran to him, taking the handle, pouring water onto the blaze. The fire hissed, retreated, then surged again, with renewed fury. Hours blurred into one long battle of heat and smoke. By the time the flames died down, dawn was breaking, painting the sky in weary gray. The pasture lay blackened, cattle scattered and lowing in terror. Elizabeth collapsed to her knees, her body shaking, hair plastered to her face. Thomas stood over the charred land, shoulders heaving, his eyes cold with fury. "This was a warning," he said hoarsely. "Next time, he won't aim for pasture. He'll aim for us." Elizabeth pressed her palm to the earth, still warm, and felt tears sting her eyes. "Then we have to end it, Thomas. Before he ends us." He turned to her, his gaze piercing. "You speak of killing a man." Her throat tightened, but she forced the words out. "I speak of surviving." For a long moment, he studied her, searching her face for the woman he thought he knew, the imposter, the substitute bride. What he saw instead was the truth. A woman forged by fire, ready to fight beside him, no matter the cost. He reached down, pulling her to her feet. His hand lingered on hers, calloused and strong, and in his eyes flickered something unspoken, something that terrified her more than Pike's fire. "Then we fight," he said at last. As the sun rose over the blackened prairie, Elizabeth knew their battle with Pike was no longer just survival. It was war. And in the ashes of the pasture, hidden by smoke and shadow, Pike's men left their mark, a crude symbol carved into the earth, a promise that the next fire would not stop at the fences. It would burn straight through the Callahan home. The symbol in the ashes haunted Elizabeth long after the flames were gone. It was crude, carved deep into the charred soil with a knife, a jagged P, the mark of Pike. Every time her eyes drifted toward the blackened pasture, she felt it staring back at her like a brand, a promise. The ranch became a fortress in the days that followed. Thomas worked without rest, his jaw locked tight, repairing fences and moving cattle closer to the house where they could be guarded. He barely spoke, but when he did, it was always about preparations. The count of bullets, the placement of lanterns, the angle of the windows for defense. Samuel mirrored his father's grim focus. He drilled with the rifle each day, his hands still awkward, but his aim growing steadier. Elizabeth's heart twisted each time she saw him line up the sights, the boy's childhood vanishing into the barrel of a gun. Elizabeth threw herself into chores with a kind of desperation. She cooked, mended, hauled, anything to keep the family fed and the house ready. But every scrape of a chair, every creak of the barn door sent her nerves spiraling. Pike's threat hung over them like storm clouds, gathering on the horizon. One evening, as the sun sank blood-red, Elizabeth found Thomas standing at the corral, staring out at the endless prairie. His hands gripped the rail so tightly, his knuckles were white. She approached slowly, shawl wrapped around her shoulders, the silence stretching long between them. "He'll come soon," she said quietly. Thomas didn't look at her. "I should have ended him years ago." She swallowed. "You didn't because you're not like him." His head turned, his eyes sharp. "That mercy may cost me this ranch, may cost Samuel, may cost you." Elizabeth stepped closer, her voice trembling but firm. "Then let me bear the cost too. Don't shut me out of this fight, Thomas. I've carried my share already." His gaze softened just slightly. For the first time since her secret was exposed, he didn't look at her like a deceiver, but like an equal. Before either could speak further, the distant sound of hooves shattered the fragile moment. Not one horse, many. Thomas stiffened, eyes narrowing toward the ridge. Dust rose in the dying light, a line of riders cutting across the horizon. Pike had returned. "Inside," Thomas ordered, his voice sharp. But Elizabeth shook her head. "Not this time." He glared, but there was no time for argument. He grabbed her arm, pressing a revolver into her hand. "Then stay close, and don't hesitate." Samuel burst from the barn, clutching his rifle. His face was pale, but his jaw set with a determination that looked far too much like his father's. Thomas gave him a curt nod. "Behind cover. Wait for my word." The riders closed in, a dozen at least, their rifles gleaming in the dusk. Pike rode at the front, his wounded arm bound, but his sneer unchanged. "Callahan!" he shouted, his voice echoing across the yard. "I gave you fair warning. This land, this family, it ain't yours. Best hand it over before I take it piece by piece." Thomas stepped forward, rifle in hand, his figure dark against the last light of day. "You'll take nothing from me, Pike. Not land, not blood, not her." Elizabeth's chest clenched at the final word, but before she could grasp it, Pike barked a laugh. "Her?" He spit the word like venom. "You mean the liar? Whole town knows now, Callahan. Knows she tricked you. What kind of man builds his house on lies?" The words cut deep, and Elizabeth felt shame burn through her. But she forced herself to stand tall, revolver steady in her hand. "Better lies with courage than truth with cruelty, Pike. At least I stand for something." "What do you stand for?" "Vengeance and ash." The men behind Pike shifted uneasily. Her voice carried with a conviction she hadn't known she possessed. Pike's sneer faltered, just for a breath, before twisting into rage. "Enough talk. Burn it all." The riders spurred forward, torches flaring, guns drawn. The yard erupted in chaos. Gunfire cracked, sparks rained, horses screamed. Thomas fired with ruthless precision, dropping the first man before he reached the corral. Samuel crouched behind the fence, his shots shaky but determined. Elizabeth darted toward the porch, firing at shadows, her shawl slipping from her shoulders as the recoil jolted her arms. Bullets splintered wood around her, but she held fast, reloading with shaking hands. Flames licked at the barn as one of Pike's men hurled a torch. Elizabeth's scream tore from her throat as the dry timber caught. Thomas charged forward, gunning the man down, then shouted to Samuel, "Water! Buckets!" The boy ran, hauling water from the trough, his small body straining under the weight. Elizabeth joined him, the two of them dousing flames with frantic desperation as Thomas held the line. Pike circled the chaos like a vulture, his sneer illuminated by firelight. His eyes locked on Elizabeth, and he spurred his horse hard, charging straight for the porch. She raised the revolver, heart hammering, but before she could fire, Thomas's rifle barked. Pike's horse reared, throwing him hard into the dirt. The outlaw scrambled to his feet, wounded but not broken, his pistol gleaming. He leveled it at Elizabeth. "Run!" Thomas shouted. But Elizabeth didn't move. She raised her revolver, hands steady now, eyes locked on Pike. Time seemed to slow, the air thick with smoke and fear. Her finger tightened on the trigger, and in that instant, the battle hung by a thread, balanced between survival and destruction. The next shot fired would decide not only the fight, but the fate of every soul on the Callahan ranch. The gunfire cracked like lightning, shattering the fragile pause. Pike's pistol roared first, the muzzle flash, lighting his scarred face in the fire's glow. Elizabeth flinched, but her own revolver barked a heartbeat later. The world narrowed to smoke, sound, and the violent kick against her palm. Pike staggered, his shot going wide, tearing splinters from the porch beam inches from her head. Elizabeth's bullet struck his shoulder, spinning him backward into the dirt. He let out a guttural roar, clutching the wound, his eyes blazing with hatred. "Elizabeth!" Thomas's voice rang out, raw and commanding. He was already charging across the yard, rifle raised. Pike's men faltered at the sight of their leader downed, their formation breaking. But Pike wasn't finished. He rolled to his knees, teeth bared, pistol raised again. His gaze locked on Elizabeth with venomous intent. "You should have stayed in your sister's shadow," he snarled. Time seemed to stretch. Elizabeth saw the hate in his eyes, the fire behind him, Samuel screaming somewhere near the barn. She felt the weight of her deception, of her choices, pressing down. And then, in that crushing moment, something fierce and clear rose inside her. She wasn't Margaret, and she wasn't a substitute. She was Elizabeth Callahan, whether Thomas admitted it yet or not. She fired again. The shot struck true. Pike collapsed backward, his pistol clattering to the dirt. His body twitched once, then went still. For a moment, the ranch fell into stunned silence. Then Thomas was there, standing over Pike's fallen form, rifle still trained. His chest heaved, his jaw locked. But when he looked back at Elizabeth, there was something burning in his eyes, something beyond shock, something closer to pride. "Pa!" Samuel's voice cut through the smoke. He came running from the barn, soot streaked across his face, clutching the empty rifle. His small frame shook, but his eyes were wide with awe. She stopped him. Thomas lowered his rifle at last. He turned fully to Elizabeth, his gaze searching, heavy, as if seeing her for the first time. Not the imposter, not the mistake, but the woman who had stood her ground when it mattered most. "You didn't run," he said, voice rough. Elizabeth's chest ached. "I told you I wouldn't." The remaining riders, seeing their leader down, broke ranks. Some fled into the prairie, spurred by fear, others dragging their wounded with them. The fire at the barn sputtered under the last of the water Samuel had hauled, leaving only smoke and scorched wood behind. The Callahan ranch stood battered, blackened, but unbroken. Thomas knelt briefly by Pike's body, his face unreadable, then rose and walked back to Elizabeth. For a long moment, they stood only a breath apart, the firelight flickering between them. "You saved us," he said quietly. Elizabeth shook her head. "We saved each other." Something in his expression softened, the iron lines of his jaw easing. His hand lifted, hesitant, before brushing a strand of soot-streaked hair from her face. For the first time since she arrived, his touch was not duty, not command, but choice. "Whatever lie brought you here," he said, his voice steady but low. "Tonight proved one thing. You belong. Whether you were meant to or not, you belong." Elizabeth's eyes stung with tears. The weight she had carried since the train ride, the crushing guilt of deception, seemed to ease beneath his words. For the first time, she believed it too. But even as relief washed through her, she knew the fight wasn't entirely over. Pike was gone, but his men still roamed the prairie, bitter and wounded. The ranch bore scars that would take months to heal. And the town, those whispers of her deceit, would not vanish overnight. Still, as Thomas's hand lingered against her cheek, Elizabeth felt the stirrings of something new. Hope. Fragile, yes, but fierce enough to light the darkness. Samuel broke the silence with a shaky laugh, half sob, half triumph. "We did it, Pa. We really did." Thomas's arm wrapped briefly around his son's shoulders, drawing him close. Then his gaze returned to Elizabeth, unwavering. "We did." And yet, as the prairie wind carried away the smoke of battle, far off on the horizon, a lone rider paused at the ridge, watching the Callahan ranch with cold, calculating eyes. Pike was dead, but not every enemy was buried. The West had a way of testing every vow, every love, and the hardest test was yet to come. The prairie dawn after the battle carried an eerie calm. Smoke still curled from the blackened edges of the barn, the acrid scent clinging to the morning air. Elizabeth stood at the porch rail, shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, watching the pale light creep across the land they had defended with blood and fire. Inside, Thomas and Samuel slept where exhaustion had dropped them. Father in his chair by the hearth, rifle across his lap, son curled up beneath a blanket, soot still streaked across his cheeks. Elizabeth had tended their wounds as best she could, hands steady despite the tremor of her own body. Now, as silence pressed down, she finally let herself feel the weight of what they had survived. Pike was gone. But Pike's shadow lingered. By mid-morning, riders from town arrived, neighbors who had seen smoke or heard gunfire carried by the wind. They dismounted cautiously, eyes darting between the scorched pasture and the lifeless body still lying where Pike had fallen. One of them, A wiry man with sharp features spat into the dirt. So it's true then. Callahan's got himself a bride who ain't who she claimed. Brought trouble on us all. Elizabeth flinched. Thomas stepped out onto the porch, weary but unbowed. His voice carried iron. Trouble was Pike, and trouble's gone. You want to thank someone? Thank her. He nodded toward Elizabeth, who stood trembling in the doorway. She faced him down, when others ran. Murmurs rippled through the men. Some frowned, others glanced at her with new respect. But the wiry man sneered. She deceived you, Callahan. Whole town knows. A woman who lies ain't fit to stand as wife. Elizabeth's breath caught. Her fingers dug into the shawl, the shame she had carried threatening to choke her. But before she could retreat, Samuel's voice rang out behind her, surprisingly fierce. She saved us, the boy shouted, his small fists clenched. She saved me. The words cut through the murmurs like a blade. Elizabeth turned, her heart twisting at the sight of him standing there, so young yet so sure. Thomas's eyes flicked from his son to her, steady and unreadable. Then, with deliberate steps, Thomas walked back up the porch, standing beside her. His presence loomed solid, unshaken. This woman bears my name now, he said, voice low but carrying. She stands on this land as surely as I do. Any man who says different can answer to me. The weight of his words settled like stone. No one challenged him. One by one, the neighbors mounted their horses again, muttering but subdued, and rode back toward town. Only the wiry man lingered, his eyes narrowing at Elizabeth before he spat once more and turned his horse. Silence returned. Elizabeth's chest heaved, tears burning her eyes. She turned to Thomas, her lips trembling. Why would you claim me so openly, after all I've done? His gaze held hers, steady and unwavering. Because you've proven more than truth can. Out here, a woman's worth isn't in a name written on paper. It's in the ground she stands and the fire she faces. And you stood. Her tears spilled, but this time they carried relief. She pressed the shawl against her chest, its worn fabric suddenly heavier with meaning. That evening, the three of them sat by the fire. Samuel leaned against Elizabeth's shoulder, sleep tugging at his small frame. Thomas sat across from them, his rifle finally set aside, his eyes softer than she had ever seen. You'll have to face the town, he said quietly, his gaze fixed on her. There'll be whispers for a long time. Questions. Judgment. Elizabeth swallowed, fear knotting in her throat. And if I can't bear it? His jaw tightened, then eased. Then I'll bear it beside you. The simple words hit her harder than any bullet. They weren't a promise of romance, not yet, but they were something deeper, an oath of loyalty, of partnership. And in this harsh land, that was love in its truest form. Outside, the prairie wind whistled through the grass, carrying away the last smoke of Pike's fire. The ranch still bore scars, and so did their hearts. But for the first time since she stepped off the train, Elizabeth felt something unshakable rooting her to this place. Belonging. She looked down at Samuel, then across the flames at Thomas, and whispered, "Then let them judge. I'll stand." But what none of them knew was that Pike's death had stirred another hunger in town. Men who saw weakness in the Callahan's scars, and who would soon test just how strong this fragile new family truly was. The church bell of Mallister rang out across the prairie, its solemn tone carrying farther than the voices of men. Elizabeth rode into town beside Thomas, Samuel trailing close behind, the three of them cutting a quiet, tense figure. The ride felt longer than the miles it covered, the eyes of neighbors following them even before they reached Main Street. Word of Pike's death had traveled faster than smoke, and the whispers were louder than the wind. Elizabeth kept her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, though the sun was warm. It was her armor, thin as it was. Each step of her horse echoed like a drumbeat, and she felt the town's judgment pressing heavier with every hoof-fall. The sheriff stood waiting near the saloon, arms crossed. Around him, men gathered in clusters, muttering, staring. Women peeked from windows, children hushed by stern hands. Pike had been feared, but he had also been known. His end stirred more than relief. It stirred questions, and Elizabeth knew she was at the center of them. Thomas dismounted first, his boots striking the dirt with steady force. He helped Samuel down, then turned to her, his hand extended, firm and unyielding. For a moment, Elizabeth hesitated. If she took that hand here, before all these eyes, there would be no turning back. She would be claiming not just her place beside him, but also the weight of her lie, the whispers, the gossip. Her breath caught, but she placed her hand in his. He held it strong, guiding her down, steadying her as though he dared anyone to see weakness. The sheriff's voice broke the hush. "Callahan, folks are saying Pike's blood is on your land, that his men are scattered but bitter, and that you've brought this woman here under false pretenses." A ripple of murmurs followed. Elizabeth felt her knees threaten to buckle. Thomas's jaw tightened, his voice ringing out steady. "Pike came to take what wasn't his. He lit fire to my land, and he raised his gun against my family. He died because he chose wrong. That's the end of it." The sheriff's gaze slid to Elizabeth. And her? Every eye turned. The whispers hissed like snakes. She tricked him. She ain't the one. Liar. Substitute. Elizabeth's heart thundered. She wanted to run, to shrink into nothing. But then Samuel's small hand slipped into hers, grounding her. And Thomas didn't let go. His grip only tightened. She lifted her chin, voice trembling at first but growing stronger. "It's true. I wasn't the sister promised. I came in her place. I lied because I was afraid. Afraid of what would happen to my family. Afraid of what would happen to me. And I carried that lie across miles of land and storms of guilt. But when Pike came, when fire threatened this home, I stood. I fought. I bled. Not as Margaret. Not as a substitute. As Elizabeth." Silence stretched. The crowd shifted uneasily, some frowning, others softening. The wiry man who had sneered at the ranch days earlier stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Words don't change what she is. She don't belong here." Before Elizabeth could falter, Thomas stepped between them, his height and presence casting a long shadow. His voice thundered, harder than steel. "She belongs to me, to this land, to Samuel. And if anyone says different, they'll answer to Callahan Steele." He rested his hand on the rifle slung at his side, not as a threat, but as a promise. A murmur rippled again, but this time softer, less certain. The sheriff raised a hand. "That's enough. What's done is done. Pike's gone, and his men will scatter soon enough. If this woman stood and fought, then she's proven more than most. Let the Callahans keep their peace." The wiry man cursed under his breath, but he stepped back, and the tension in the air slowly eased. The crowd began to thin, some with reluctant nods, others with curious glances, but the sting of judgment lingered like dust in Elizabeth's throat. When at last the street cleared, Elizabeth turned to Thomas, her eyes wet. "You didn't have to do that." His gaze softened, his voice low enough only for her. "I did. Because it's the truth. You're not her, Elizabeth. You're you. And that's who I chose." Her breath caught, tears spilling freely now, but not of shame. For the first time since stepping off the train, she felt the weight lift. Not because the town had accepted her, but because Thomas had. That night, back at the ranch, the three of them sat by the fire. The barn still smelled of smoke, the fences still bore scars, but the house was warm. Samuel leaned against Elizabeth's side, his eyes heavy with sleep, while Thomas sat across, his face lit by the glow of the flames. Outside, the prairie stretched endless and silent, the wind carrying no threats, only promise. Elizabeth clutched the blue shawl at her shoulders, not as a shield now, but as a memory, a reminder of where she had come from, and of the family she had found here. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine tomorrow, not just survival, not just penance, but a life, a home, a love, chosen and true. And as Thomas's gaze lingered on her across the fire, steady and unflinching, she knew that whatever storms the West would bring, they would face them together. Because the girl who came in her sister's place had become the woman who was chosen forever. The seasons turned, as they always did on the wide, unyielding prairie. Spring thawed the earth. Summer baked it. Autumn painted it in gold, and winter wrapped it in silence. And through it all, the Callahan Ranch endured, not untouched by hardship, but stronger because of it. The fire scars on the pasture gave way to new grass, green and stubborn. The blackened beams of the barn were replaced by fresh timber, each strike of the hammer echoing with resilience. The fences stood firm again, Samuel's small hands learning alongside his father's. The boy's laughter returned in bursts, no longer silenced by fear, but tempered with the memory of what they had faced together. Elizabeth found her place not through title or promise, but through the rhythm of the land. She rose with the sun, her hands calloused by work, her skirts torn by thorn and dust. She learned the language of cattle, the moods of the soil, the warning signs of the sky. She burned pies and mended them, stumbled and steadied, until the neighbors who once whispered "liar" found themselves nodding in grudging respect when she walked through town with Thomas at her side. The blue shawl still hung by her bed, no longer a shield of shame, but a symbol of endurance. Its frayed edges reminded her of where she had come from, and of the choice that had set her on this path, not Margaret's, not her mother's, but her own. She was not borrowed anymore. She was not instead of. She was Elizabeth Callahan, and the ranch bore her name as surely as it bore Thomas's. Thomas himself had changed in ways few would notice but her. The hard lines of his face softened at the corners, his eyes no longer clouded only by duty, but warmed by something he rarely spoke aloud. He still worked with the same relentless drive, still carried the weight of protector and provider. But there were moments, quiet, fleeting, when he let himself simply be a man beside the woman who had chosen to stay. In those moments, the ranch felt less like a fortress and more like a home. Their bond was not a sudden blaze but a steady flame, built in silence and firelight, in storms weathered side by side, in battles fought with grit and truth. Love in the West was not spoken in grand declarations. It was spoken in calloused hands, reaching for each other at the end of a long day, in trust rebuilt nail by nail, in the simple act of not running when the storm rose. And Samuel, caught between boyhood and manhood, grew into the promise of both. He carried the memory of his mother in his quiet strength, and the presence of Elizabeth in his laughter's return. He tested boundaries, argued chores, but at night he lingered at her side, asking questions about a world he was still learning to understand. To him, she was not instead of. She was simply Ma. The town, too, shifted in time. Whispers dulled, replaced by nods of acknowledgement when Elizabeth traded flour or fabric. Some never forgave, but most forgot, and those who remembered had no choice but to respect the woman who had stood with rifle in hand when Pike came to burn them out. On quiet evenings, when the prairie stretched endless under a sky filled with stars, Elizabeth and Thomas sat together on the porch. The land smelled of sage and smoke, of dust and life. Samuel's laughter sometimes drifted from inside, other times the soft strum of a fiddle he had bartered for in town. One evening, as the horizon blazed with sunset, Thomas reached over, his hand covering hers on the railing. He didn't speak, and he didn't need to. The weight of his touch carried every word he had never said aloud. She turned her hand, lacing her fingers through his, her heart steady. "I used to think I was just borrowed," she whispered, her eyes on the fading light. "Like I was living someone else's life. But now, it feels like this was where I was always meant to be." Thomas's gaze stayed on the horizon, but his thumb brushed across her knuckles. Some truths take longer to show themselves, but when they do, they're stronger than any lie. Elizabeth's lips curved, tears pricking her eyes, though they didn't fall. She leaned her head against his shoulder, letting the silence carry them. The prairie would never stop testing them. Storms would come, winters would bite, men like Pike would rise again in different shapes and names. But the Callahans would endure, not because they were spared hardship, but because they faced it together. Elizabeth, once a substitute bride, had become more than any promise written on paper. She was the heart of the ranch, the keeper of its fire, the woman chosen not by chance, but by the crucible of survival, and the quiet, steady choice of love made each day. And as the stars kindled in the vast, eternal sky, the Callahan Ranch stood, not unscarred, but unbroken, its story etched into the land like a vow, forever chosen, forever theirs.